everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And this lecture is French Canada, Part 2, Envisioning a Province. And this is brought to you by the Great Plains Midwest. So this lecture continues in the ongoing series on the early colonization of North America. And I'll also be working soon on the next Doorways in Time, which should be on the bog bodies. That's what won the poll on Patreon. And also I've been discussing with my brother and some listeners the idea of holding a live discussion with patrons on one or more subjects like the Industrial Revolution or other myths of the month. And these latest lectures on the Industrial Revolution have gotten the most response out of anything I've ever posted. So I'd be interested to know what people think of that and what sort of things people might want to talk about. But now I'll continue the story of French Canada. So in the last lecture, we saw how Frenchmen traded for furs along the St. Lawrence River for about a century and repeatedly tried and failed to plant a colony there until finally in 1608, Samuel de Champlain created the outpost of Quebec at a strategic narrow point of the river. And we discussed how the colony slowly grew to include other towns at Trois-Rivières and Montreal, and also a series of Catholic missions all around the French settlements, most important among them being the mission at the large and powerful Wendat Confederacy in the west near the Great Lakes. And we saw how the colony was secured by a system of alliances which held together the so-called Laurentian coalition against their main shared enemy, namely the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the south. And we saw how the colony and their allies engaged in a long, grinding war against the Haudenosaunee, mainly involving brutal raids around the St. Lawrence Valley, until finally, in 1648, a Haudenosaunee war party invaded the Wendat homeland directly and began destroying villages and taking captives. And we left off in March 1649, when a large, well-armed Haudenosaunee force attacked and occupied the Christian Wendat village of Saint-Ignace, and from there marched on to Saint-Louis, possibly because they knew that it was serving as the seat of the main Jesuit leaders, Jean de Brébeuf and Gabriel Lalemant. And these priests were important links in the diplomatic chain connecting the Wendats and New France, so they made obvious targets if the Haudenosaunee wanted to break that alliance. So these Jesuits could have fled at this point, but instead they chose to stay and to suffer the same fates that awaited their flock. At worst, they would have the chance to die as martyrs. So the town of Saint-Louis was attacked and quickly destroyed. Brébeuf and Lalemant were taken as prisoners back to Saint-Ignace, paraded and pelted with stones, and finally tortured and killed, as the Haudenosaunee considered this to be the most respectful way of disposing of a captured enemy. And a year of chaos ensued, where the Wendat were forced to disperse and flee as hundreds more were killed or captured. And amidst the destruction, the Wendat looked for different ways to survive. Some surrendered and hoped to survive as captives of the Haudenosaunee. Others fled to other tribes. And over the course of this time, more than 2,000 more Wendats converted to Christianity as a last-ditch effort to survive this disaster. But in December of 1649, 2 more Jesuit missionaries were captured, tortured, and killed. And the remaining priests were then forced to abandon the mission at Sainte-Marie-aux-Hurons and to withdraw with their congregants to an island in Lake Huron. But they arrived there too late to plant crops, and most starved through the winter of 1649 to 50. Finally, in 1650, the few hundred surviving Christian Wendats relocated into the St. Lawrence Valley. In 1651, some of these built a fortified village on Ile d'Orléans, the large island in the St. Lawrence River just east of Quebec. And this presumably would be safe due to its distance, its proximity to the main French stronghold, and the fact that it was an island. But nonetheless, the Haudenosaunee soon attacked them even there, and finally the Wendats decamped to the mainland even closer to Quebec. And still, as of 1652, most of the St. Lawrence Valley outside of the main three French towns was so strafed with constant raids by Haudenosaunee warriors that it again became a kind of no man's land, much as it had been 100 years before, and colonists and their allies could only travel between the French towns in large armed convoys. So this disaster severely curtailed the colony's trade. Migration into the settlements largely stopped, and by 1653 the population of all of New France leveled off at only about 2,000 colonists. By 1654, France's commitment to protecting their allies was clearly wavering. They had done little to defend the surviving Wendat refugees from continuing raids, like on Ile d'Orléans, and the coalition partners finally were forced to call a truce with the Haudenosaunee. Negotiations were then opened up at Quebec to determine what would become of the remaining Wendat. Would they resettle under French suzerainty and protection? Some favored this, especially the Christians among them. Would they resettle somewhere else far away on their own and try to somehow defend themselves? This seemed unlikely given their small numbers and the devastation and scattering of the Wendat. Or would they resettle with Algonquian allies, despite huge differences in language and lifeways and their weak numbers? The Algonquians had also been devastated by disease and warfare. Or finally, would they resettle among the Haudenosaunee? And this last idea may seem crazy to us. Why would you resettle among mortal enemies who had just destroyed your home country, killing thousands of your countrymen? But remember, the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee were all Iroquoians and had similar languages and traditions, and it was customary for captives from the vanquished party in a war to be adopted and integrated into the tribes of the victorious party. And this is exactly what the Haudenosaunee, in particular the Mohawks and the Onondaga, offered to do. They would bring in the surviving Wendats and integrate them into their tribes. And remember, for the Haudenosaunee, the main point of this whole war in the first place was to take captives, and so to gain new infusions of people demographically. So in the mid-1650s, the Mohawks and the Onondaga in particular represented the Haudenosaunee in diplomatic talks, in which they then tried to outbid each other, basically making increasingly generous offers to the defeated Wendats and to any Algonquians who might listen as well, trying to persuade the survivors to come and live with them, either with the Onondaga or with the Mohawk. And eventually, after about 3 years, the Wendats split into 3 camps. So the largest group agreed to go with the Mohawks. Another, somewhat smaller group would go to live among the Onondaga, and only a very small group of mostly Christian Wendats would remain near to Quebec as allies of the French. So by this point, even with the truce, it seemed that the French colony was hanging by a thread. Their main ally, what was left of them, wasn't even sticking with them, but instead was going over and would be boosting the numbers of their main enemy. So the Laurentian allies were devastated and diminished by both disease and war. Quebec was largely cut off from the west, with trade stagnant and immigration halted. And meanwhile, upriver, the main forward French outpost of Montreal was left with still fewer than 100 people, even with the refugees that had come from Huronia. And this western settlement especially was hanging by a thread and in danger of being destroyed in the next Haudenosaunee attack. So all in all, this war turned out to be a disaster and a huge body blow for Canada and for New France. And it could easily have led to the total abandonment, perhaps just of Montreal or even of the whole colony. But nonetheless, the colony hung on, mainly due to church investment. So what saved the colony really was religious fervor, and there were great advantages to religion as the main driving force of the colonial project. For one thing, it could draw investment from French civil society and the aristocracy, even when the crown was distracted. And so sort of strategic reasons of state were not enough to bring in investment and manpower. This church investment and religious enthusiasm did not depend upon turning a profit. and it could attract the support of wealthy patrons who wanted to show their piety by supporting a good cause, no matter how quixotic or even wasteful it was. It did not depend upon persuading people that Canada was a good place to live. Paradoxically, Canada's horrible image and reputation in France could actually redound to their benefit. It could show the colony as a great place to go and suffer for the faith. It drew upon this sort of religious martyr complex. And most importantly of all, it did not depend upon victory in war. So again, paradoxically, the Christian mission thrived off of military and political failure, which produced martyrs. Most prominently among them now, Jean de Brébeuf and the other Jesuit fathers in Huronia, who had been killed by the Haudenosaunee. They quickly came to be seen as holy figures. Their deaths were presented as martyrdoms for the faith and were reported in great detail in the Jesuit relations. And they soon entered into the religious iconography of not only the colony but of the mother country as well. And the entire group of Jesuits who had died in the mission field from the 1630s through the 1640s, they came to be known collectively as the Canadian Martyrs. And they served as heroes and symbols of French America. And I've even been told personally that right up to recent times in Franco-American homes, such as in Quebec or Louisiana, one would likely see prints of these martyrs on the wall, much as in Anglo-American households you might see images of George Washington or the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. But even early on, the story of these Canadian martyrs fired further zeal for the cause of evangelizing the continent. And there were two major beneficiaries of this missionary zeal in French Canada in the 1650s. One was the nuns or religious sisters of Quebec. So they became the main conservators of the legacy of the martyrs. And right away in 1649, the remains of Jean de Brébeuf were exhumed from the grave in Huronia and moved to Quebec, where they were entrusted to the Augustinian sisters at the Hôtel Dieu, or hospital. And over the course of the 1650s, nuns there began to report visions and healing miracles associated with these relics. At the same time, in the aftermath of the destruction of Huronia, the Haudenosaunee War was dragging on, and many other indigenous nations were suffering and losing numbers to violence and disease, and the French colony seemed in danger of destruction as well. So you could say there was a kind of apocalyptic atmosphere hanging over the colony. So the nuns of Quebec adopted a style of severe ascetic and introspective piety, which could be seen as appropriate to this sort of dire mood. And this set the tone, you could say, for a distinctive Canadian style of French Catholicism. As we mentioned last time, Marie de l'Incarnation, the head of the Ursulines, was a committed mystic and student of Teresa of Avila, and she recorded visions of Christ and the Trinity, at the same time that she was diligently running the girls' school and becoming a major pillar of civil society in the colony. So Marie and her sisters did not have the same formal powers as the Jesuits and the other priests, but they did have certain advantages that made them important and influential in a way that the missionaries were not. Most significantly, the Jesuits repeatedly shuffled around from post to post, often in remote places, and were sometimes called out of the colony together to some other project somewhere else on the globe. Whereas the religious sisters in Quebec generally committed to their posts for life. And so they served as anchors of continuity in the very tumultuous life of the colony. And very importantly, Marie de l'Incarnation saw her life in the convent as penitential, both serving Christ and helping to atone for the sins of the community, and hence helping to save the colony from destruction. And hence you can see her as modeling this peculiar combination of active, diligent service in the world with a mystical and introspective spiritual life. Another important mystic who followed in a similar vein to Marie de l'Incarnation was Sister Marie-Catherine de Saint-Augustin, who was a young nun from Normandy of the Augustinian order who came over to Quebec in 1649, aged only 16. So she was very young and stepping into this volatile situation right at the height of the Haudenosaunee War. And she helped to run the Hôtel Dieu, but also had mystical visions like Marie, and over time she withdrew more into isolation in the convent, pursuing fasting and prayer, and she imposed ascetic privations and mortifications upon herself. Some of these were traditional, like wearing a hair shirt, and some were new and original, seemingly inspired by the harsh landscape of Canada, such as burying herself up to her neck in snow for long periods of time. And all in all, these nuns combined active service to the community outside the cloister with extreme ascetic piety and visionary introspection within it. And this became a sort of distinctive style of piety, which attracted interest and respect not only among the colonists, but also back in France. And the nuns, especially Marie de l'Incarnation, became rather famous in France, and the Jesuits had her write significant sections of their relations to be circulated in the mother country. It also attracted interest and respect among the indigenous people. So indigenous North Americans had long-standing spiritual traditions that included practices of self-isolation and privations like fasting, and these were intended to enable communication with the spirit world. So evidently the piety and mystical visions of the nuns at Quebec were quite understandable in light of these indigenous spiritual traditions, and perhaps it was even inspired by them. I don't know exactly how much that possibility has been explored. But remember, the schools in Quebec, including the Ursulines School for Girls, run by Marie de l'Incarnation, these were originally conceived as sites for the education and evangelization of Indians, and a large share of the students that Marie taught at Quebec were indigenous. But regardless of who inspired whom, by 1660 a tradition of ascetic and visionary Catholic piety was established, which would take root particularly among women, both French and indigenous, and would soon produce more famous figures, one of whom we'll mention a bit later. Now, the other big beneficiary of the missionary zeal of the 1650s, aside from the nuns of Quebec, was the Société de Notre-Dame de Montréal, which had just founded the town of Montreal in the middle of a war zone. As of 1650, this town was barely clinging to existence, and the Society's vision of creating an Indian Christian utopia was just not panning out. But in 1651, the governor Maisonneuve and his associates traveled to France, and there they tapped into the growing fascination with the Christian mission in Canada. They were able to drum up support again, raise money, and recruit about 200 people to go to Montreal, replenish the colony's numbers, and most importantly, bolster the militia. This group also included some women, some of them with husbands and some single, who then soon after married. There were plenty of men interested in them in the colony. And the population in Montreal soon began to reproduce itself. And this infusion of new manpower came just in time, so the town managed to hold on. Even the smallest settlement at Montreal clung to existence and soon after began to grow. In the mid-1650s, Maisonneuve began to parcel out strips of land for settlers to farm around the town, and houses began to be built along a road running along the riverbank called Rue Saint-Paul. And the soldier adventurers soon settled down and became what were known as habitants, settlers, inhabitants, farmers. In 1657, crucially, they were joined by new clergy. So these included several more nuns from Anjou in France and a group of priests belonging to the Sulpician Society. So this was a new order that had just recently been formed at Paris with its own seminary at the Church of Saint-Sulpice, and it was organized to educate priests and train them in pastoral work. And these Sulpicians at Montreal soon began to set up the town's first permanent parish church. And shortly after, a young female missionary named Marguerite Bourgeois opened up a school in a disused barn. So although it's still very much nascent, they're starting to develop the same sort of institutions that one saw at Quebec. And it was clear that the church was growing, now with at least 4 different orders in the colony and several parishes. And it needed a leader to oversee and coordinate this work and manage conflicts between these different parties within the church. And so soon the Sulpicians and the Jesuits each put forward their own preferred candidates for whom they wanted to see appointed as leader or even bishop of the Church of Canada. And there was an intense contest. The Sulpicians didn't want to be completely dominated and to see their church governed by the Jesuits. Likewise, the Jesuits were afraid that if the Sulpicians gained higher authority, they would then subordinate the church in the colony to Paris and the crown, rather than keeping it part of this global Jesuit project. So there was a real political tug of war, and ultimately in 1658, the Jesuits won out, and the crown appointed the French priest François de Laval, who had been educated by Jesuits in France, to be the so-called Vicar Apostolic of New France. So this was a title for a leader in a missionary province, which would not yet have the full independence of its own bishop and diocese, but instead it would report to the Vatican and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And this was an arrangement that was very amenable to the Jesuits, who were closely tied to the papacy and the Vatican. So in 1659, François de Laval arrived in Quebec and set up the apostolic headquarters there. And he took up the charge of a church with 17 Jesuit missionaries, 2 small convents of nuns, 6 ordinary secular priests not belonging to any order, and 4 Sulpicians. And he ended up becoming later a full-fledged bishop. This would come more than a decade later. Nonetheless, even before that, having this vicar apostolic in place was a major advance for the colony and a reaffirmation of the primacy of Quebec and of the Jesuits. So correspondingly, it was a setback for the Montrealiste and especially the Sulpicians. But nonetheless, the town upriver persisted and continued to grow. In 1659, another party of almost 100 people was recruited in France to cross the ocean and travel upriver to settle at Montreal. And this group included more nuns of the Hospitaller order, some artisans, and several unmarried women, couples, and families, which fueled a further baby boom. And the habitants in this area soon also brought in indentured laborers to work in workshops, on farms, and in clearing land for more farmland. So Montreal soon eclipsed Trois-Rivières and became the second largest settlement in the colony after Quebec. But it still was not nearly as large a center for the fur trade because the lands and waterways around the island were less safe, and the indigenous people did not often land there to trade, but preferred instead to trek overland to Trois-Rivières, to Quebec, or even all the way to Tadoussac by safer, more northerly routes, less vulnerable to be attacked from the south. So beginning in 1660, the settlers at Montreal began to send traders out westward into the Pays d'en-Haut to obtain furs directly from the sources and bring them back to Montreal. And this seemed very promising, if also very risky. In May 1660, while 2 merchants were away on their first trip up to the Pays d'en-Haut, a battle broke out on the Ottawa River, just west of the town, between the French and their allies on the one side and a Haudenosaunee war party on the other. And in this battle, the French-aligned fighters were all killed, so trade expansion was clearly still very dangerous and costly. And as of the end of 1660, it was doubtful whether the colony of Canada as a whole was a fiscally or militarily sustainable enterprise. It was still fairly insecure, with small, widely dispersed settlements and outposts that could not function without heavy subsidies from France and from the Catholic Church. And it was increasingly eclipsed and possibly threatened, both by their traditional enemies, the Haudenosaunee, and also by the growing English settler colonies in America. But before we get to that threat from the English, let's go back to the political and military events. So we talked about how in 1654 a truce was called and negotiations were opened up as to what would happen to the Wendat. Well, in 1657, a complex agreement was finally made for most of the Wendat survivors to relocate and settle among the Haudenosaunee. The first group went south up the Richelieu River to the Mohawk lands, and the second group set out to the west, upriver, towards Montreal, ultimately to journey and join the Onondagas south of Lake Ontario. So this group of Wendat was escorted by Onondaga fighters, but as they journeyed, the Wendats and the Onondagas, who did not much like each other, unsurprisingly, they got into a violent brawl, and a large number of Wendats were killed. And this finally ruined this truce, so fighting reopened, and the Haudenosaunee raids by the Mohawk, the Onondaga, and Seneca fighters rained down again on the St. Lawrence Valley and all the way up to the depopulated Ottawa River. At this point, the French had to decide whether to finally give up, cut their old allies loose, and make a separate peace with the Haudenosaunee, or to recommit to the traditional alliances and finally really muster serious resources to strike back and defeat the Haudenosaunee. And they ended up choosing the latter option, and they began a campaign of retrenchment and militarization of the colony. This started early on in 1657. So by the time the Onondaga massacre happened, the government in France had already chosen a new governor for New France, and this was a military officer named Pierre d'Argenson. And this new governor immediately overturned the policies restricting the distribution of firearms to Indians. This was one of these peculiar French rules that had really given the Haudenosaunee a technological edge. And upon his arrival in person at Quebec in 1658, Argenson, as part of his welcoming ceremony, he immediately began handing out muskets left and right. The very next day, the colony had to rally with their allies to respond to another Haudenosaunee raid on the St. Lawrence. And over the next 2 years, Argenson and his government prepared for a more aggressive war policy to not only deter but strike back against the Haudenosaunee raiders. In 1660, the governor organized an armed task force of Wendat, Algonquian, and French fighters to sweep through the Ottawa River Valley and seek and root out the Haudenosaunee raiding parties. However, in May 1660, they were cornered by a much larger Haudenosaunee war party, and most of the indigenous fighters surrendered and defected in order to live, while the Frenchmen were captured and killed. So some of the colonists and readers in France learning about this disaster, some of them saw this defeat as another heroic martyrdom which had saved the colony, and they likened it to the Spartans fighting to the death at Thermopylae to protect Greece. But the governor d'Argenson, he was no fool. He knew that this was an outright military catastrophe, which proved finally that it would be impossible to defend the colony, much less revive its trade, without a serious investment of time, men, and money from France. So in 1661, he asked to be relieved of command and allowed to return to France. And once back in the mother country, he advocated for a real campaign to support and protect the colony. So this put the French government at home in an awkward position. They had to ask themselves, was Canada really worth it? Or was it time to cut their losses and evacuate the French colonists back to Europe? Well, the Crown had never wanted to risk all that much on New France. They always preferred to leave the enterprise to private investors and adventurers, particularly under the government of the Cardinal Mazarin, who was in power in France in the 1640s and 50s, and who completely prioritized conflicts and struggles within France against rebellions like the Fronde and against enemies in Europe. So by 1661, there was a real moment of crisis, which might have led to a final abandonment of the colony. Except that very winter, the regent, Cardinal Mazarin, died. And by this time, King Louis XIV was 22 years old, and he decided to completely end the regency and the council that had been governing on his behalf since he had come to the throne as a child. And instead, he took up command of the French state for himself and created whole new ministries that would answer directly to him. And Louis had many plans and ambitions that he had long been waiting to enact, and a lot of allies waiting in the wings, at the same time that he was still young and was looking forward to a long reign, and he was thinking very much in the long term. And Louis had a great interest in building an overseas empire. He saw this as a source of long-term strategic gain and also of glory and prestige for France. This is one thing they could hold over enemies like the Austrians. We get to have this global overseas empire. So this dream had been very much on the back burner since France had to contend with rivals and power contests on land within Europe. But Louis decided it was worth the cost and the risk. And he put his first minister of state, a young, ambitious administrator named Jean-Baptiste Colbert, in charge of the New France project. And they prepared to make significant investments to grow this enterprise. So the colony at this point already had a massive trade network, as we know, but its outposts were remote and vulnerable, and it lacked a secure base with its own reliable food supply. So Colbert envisioned creating a so-called compact colony with a dense population concentrated in arable lands along the banks of the middle St. Lawrence. And the advantages to France of this sort of colony would be strategic and economic. It would fortify French control of trade into the continent, and also there was an ideological benefit. So the French state under Louis and Colbert, it hoped to make Canada or all of New France into a kind of model for the old France. It would be a unified, centralized, homogeneous society, uniformly Catholic and French-speaking. So in 1663, in order to execute this vision, Colbert instituted a direct royal takeover of the colony's government. And he had Louis sign a series of decrees, by which, for one thing, the Company of 100 Associates was dissolved. The monopoly on the fur trade was transferred now to the French West India Company, a larger organization which was also overseeing trade in the Caribbean and Africa. Royal officials would be appointed to take up direct command in Canada, and specifically in Montreal. The autonomy and power of the Society of Notre Dame were revoked. Maisonneuve was sent back to France. The seigneurie was reassigned to the Sulpician order, which was very friendly to the French crown and the government in Paris. But civil government and the court systems were placed under the control of a royal intendant in Quebec, so it was no longer an autonomous colony within a colony. Now, a new governmental organization was set up, of course, now that the whole apparatus of the Company of 100 was gone. And this new government would revolve around a so-called sovereign council. And initially, this comprised 9 men: the governor, the head ecclesiastic of the church in the colony, the attorney general, a clerk, and 5 additional appointed councillors. So no more elected syndics. And this sovereign council was given extensive powers, a combination of executive and judiciary powers, including to collect taxes and spend public funds out of the treasury, to regulate trade, to enact police measures, to appoint petty officials, to oversee the judiciary, including by setting up lower courts, appointing judges and bailiffs, and acting as a higher court of appeal. Now, 2 years later, some of these executive powers, like control over the treasury and the appointment of administrative officials, these were transferred to a new executive office, that of the intendant. So this is a kind of general head of domestic administration. So whereas the governor was more likely a military commander, the intendant more often was trained in law. And this was much like the officials, also called intendants, that had been deployed within France decades earlier to centralize the provincial governments under Cardinal Richelieu. So from 1665 onwards, the council, the sovereign council, was somewhat weak. It could not really run affairs day to day in the colony. And instead, the regime really increasingly was overseen by 3 main executive officials: the governor, the intendant, and the head of the church. So the governor was in charge of military and diplomatic affairs, including dealings with foreign nations and indigenous allies, and of course, matters of war and peace. The intendant was the head of internal affairs in the colony, the law courts, the administration, and the recruitment and settlement of migrants was placed under the intendant's purview. Then there was the head of the church. We're talking about Bourbon France, right? There's no separation of church and state here. So the head of the church was very much enmeshed in the government. And at first, this was the vicar apostolic, namely François de Laval. And then in 1674, Quebec was elevated to the status of a diocese, so the vicar apostolic Laval received the title of bishop. And the bishop had extensive powers over land, money, and personnel. He had great social prestige and authority. And ultimately, he had control over policy areas considered to fall under church purview, such as marriage. Over the next 30 years, predominance often shifted among these three different offices, depending on which one was occupied by a major, forceful personality. And the theory or philosophy of government under this royal regime was a sort of benevolent authoritarian rule over the colonists. So crown officials could recognize legitimate private interests that they ought to satisfy as much as possible, but they could not recognize a wider public interest. So they could do things like consult with colonists on an individual basis and show concern for their preferences, but they could not allow public bodies like elected councils or assemblies that might claim to represent the public will. In other words, the regime was not in absolute tyranny, but it was not a commonwealth either. And this sort of attitude can be seen as captured in a letter from Colbert in France to the governor Frontenac in 1672, where he wrote, quote, "It is well that each speak for himself and none for all." But regardless, the first task of this new regime in the 1660s was the securing of the colony, meaning first the pacification of the St. Lawrence Valley. In 1665, for the first time ever, the crown dispatched a force of French soldiers, about 1,200 royal troops. And over the next 2 years, they embarked on a series of summer campaigns to the south into the Haudenosaunee country, attacking villages and burning farm fields. They did not win any major victories here, right? It was very difficult to engage a Haudenosaunee force that knew the terrain far better than these troops from France did. But nonetheless, they did effectively discourage the Haudenosaunee from sending more raiding parties northward to the St. Lawrence, and they forced the Confederacy to agree to a peace treaty in 1667. So after this point, the colony was much more free to grow in a way that it had not been for decades. And different officials and factions at different times took the lead in trying to consolidate this colony as a French Catholic society. So as for the French and the indigenous, the royal government desired for indigenous people to be converted and assimilated. So in effect, this nullified the Jesuits' long-standing approach, which they had developed over the decades, and it reverted the policy back to the approach of the Récollets, who saw conversion as bound up in a wider assimilation into French lifeways. As part of this shift, the royal regime formally supported and encouraged intermarriage between indigenous converts and the French, and expected that the offspring of these unions would be Catholic and French-speaking. For example, in 1667, Colbert wrote to the intendant in Canada, quote, "You must try to draw these peoples, and especially those who have embraced Christianity, into the neighborhood of our settlements, and if possible intermingle them there, so that, with the passage of time, having but one law and the same master, they will form thereby but a single people of the same blood." End quote. So you can see here when he says the same master, he means the King of France. The initial unifying factor will be loyalty to this one ruler, and then over time they will become the same blood, right? One people. They will intermingle into one. So this was the ideal policy goal that the officials in France assigned to their deputies on the ground, in this case the intendant. But really, in practice, the main institution that would actually carry this policy out was the church, which was represented on the ground mainly by the Jesuits. And Colbert wrote that the crown expected these Jesuit missionaries to, quote, "teach the native allies our language and raise them in the same customs and way of living as the French," end quote. So the notion here basically is that conversion to Christianity and assimilation into French civilization should work together, hand in glove. And this project went on for the next 25 years, mainly under the leadership of François de Laval, who was the head of the colonial church from 1659 to 1684. So Laval was a forceful and in some ways charismatic personality. He came from a minor noble family in north-central France, which had produced many clergy. He served as a church administrator and archdeacon in Normandy, a region that many of the Canadian colonists came from. And as a boy, he had belonged to a lay confraternity affiliated with the Jesuits. So he was sort of a known quantity to them. In the 1650s, as we said, when it became clear that the colony ought to have a central church leader, the Jesuits backed him as their preferred choice against the Sulpicians candidate Caylus, the head of the mission at Montreal. And it was understood that Caylus and the Sulpicians were more Gallican. They believed in an autonomous French national church under the leadership of the crown. Whereas by contrast, Laval was ultramontanist. He supported the supremacy of the Pope over the global church. He resisted allowing the crown to use the church in Canada as an instrument to build up trade or French strategic policy. And he believed instead that the church should help to shape a Catholic settler society. So he was much more in line with the Jesuits' worldview, which was highly globalist and revolved around the papacy. In 1658, he was appointed to lead the church in Canada with this title of Vicar Apostolic, and he immediately fell into intense feuds with the governor Argenson over the question of whether the fur traders should be able to trade alcohol with the natives, and secondly with the landowners and settlers in the colony. And in his time as head of the church, he tried to institute a tithe to raise money for the church directly from the settlers. And this tithe would comprise 1/13 of all the produce of the land, this being on top of the 1/10 that the censitaires already owed to the seigneurs, the landlords. And this was bitterly opposed by the small farmers, who then managed to get this tithe reduced to only 1/26 of the crop of wheat only. Also, later in the 1660s, Laval made enemies of royal civil authorities in the form of the intendants and of other religious orders who resented the domineering Jesuits, including, of course, as we said, the Sulpicians, who were based at Montreal. And finally, Laval, although he had this extensive power and prestige, he was finally put in check by an alliance of civil authorities and the non-Jesuit clergy. So in 1669, the royal intendant at that time brought the Récollet order back into the colony as a political ally. So the Récollets and the Sulpicians, together with the intendant and the civil authorities under him, formed a coalition against the Jesuits and managed to clip Laval's wings. But he still continued to be influential, and he focused on enlarging and strengthening the church in North America. In 1674, as we mentioned, he was formally elevated to the office of bishop, and the Church of New France became more autonomous as a full-fledged diocese based at Quebec. In 1684, Laval finally retired, and some degree of harmony and a new balance of power was achieved in the colony. And this new balance of power was shifted at this point in favor of the royal civil bureaucracy, especially the intendant. And specifically, the intendant who had strategically reintroduced the Récollets back into the colony was Jean Talon. So Jean Talon is a highly important figure in the formation of French Canada, even though he did not serve for nearly as long as Laval. He served two relatively brief terms, from 1665 to 68 and 1669 to 72. But he was probably the most pivotal figure in transforming the colony into a viable, productive settler society. So Talon was born in Champagne in 1626 to a high-status family which had produced some very important high-level government officials, including an Attorney General of France. He was educated at a Jesuit college, and he showed an early talent for administration. And he was appointed early in 1665 to be the first intendant of New France when he was still only 39 years old. In office, he sought to expand economic production in the colony and to make it useful as part of the larger mercantilist scheme for the French Empire. And he gave state support for new ventures like mines, lumberyards, and shipyards, trying to diversify the economy of the colony. He also encouraged diversification of agriculture, including with the introduction of new crops like hops and flax, which grew relatively well in the cold climate. And you can see this is very similar to efforts by William Barclay in Virginia at the same time, although in a very different environment. Both of these royal officials were probably aware of one another and in a sort of race to create more useful colonies in America. But French Canada was barely 1/4 the size of contemporary Virginia. So Talon was most determined to grow the population. One of his first acts coming into office was to conduct a census, and this found only 3,215 colonists living in all of New France. So Talon instituted new programs to encourage reproduction, including grants and subsidies to newly married couples and to couples who had children. And he also vigorously campaigned for more migrants from France to settle in Canada, specifically Catholic families with women and children. And this launched then a period of dramatic immigration and growth. So to achieve this, Talon had to overcome serious challenges and obstacles, including, for one, a relative lack of excess population in France as compared to England. The enclosure movement and rack renting had been much less aggressive in France than in England. Also, under law and custom, estates and tenancies were usually subdivided among heirs, and so several sons and even daughters could inherit tracts of land. Hence, there were fewer landless peasants in France, and those that there were might migrate to nearby market towns and regional cities or join the large French army. So there was much less of a pool from which to recruit migrants to resettle in the colonies. Another big challenge was Canada's horrible reputation in France. It was seen as a dangerous wasteland. Not only were there savages, but the colonists were even worse. It was widely believed the colony was populated by thieves, prostitutes, and gypsies. And like in England, criminals were sometimes offered deportation to America as an alternative to prison or execution. But unlike in England, not all of these French criminals leapt at this option. Some Frenchmen evidently saw transportation to the colonies as a fate worse than death. And thirdly, even among those that were in the colony, there was a severe sex imbalance. Very few European women lived in Canada, and a lot of these were nuns who would not marry or, in theory, not have children. This then made the colony less appealing as a prospect for male migrants, and it made it difficult for the existing colonial population to reproduce itself, much less grow, since women were the big limiting factor. So Talon had to come up with strategies to deal with all of these obstacles. As for the sex ratio, Talon tackled this by directly subsidizing the recruitment of so-called filles du roi, or daughters of the king. So this was a term for young unmarried women, ostensibly orphans, gathered from the port towns on the French coast, who were then given small dowries and sent en masse to Canada. And this term, fille du roi, served to obscure or downplay the women's origins, right? It was sort of saying, don't ask whose daughter she is. So the first shipment of these filles du roi arrived in the summer of 1667, and the migration continued for several years, ultimately adding up to about 800 young women, which may not sound huge, but it at least doubled the number of female colonists in Canada. As for a larger mass migration of farmers and families, Talon mostly outsourced this through seigneurial grants. So these were given out in great abundance in the 1660s and 70s, and they served to effectively leverage the value of these huge tracts of arable land in the St. Lawrence Valley in order to get private speculators and their agents to recruit colonists. Also, the church received about 30% of all of these seigneurial grants given out in the colony, the rest going to various military officers, merchant adventurers, lawyers, etc. So the recruiters then got several thousand people to migrate, including from the same regions that had supplied settlers to Acadia, such as the Atlantic ports of La Rochelle and others on the mid-Atlantic coast, and the regions of Osny and Saintonge to the south of La Rochelle on the southwestern coast of France. Others came from port cities like Bordeaux, farther to the south, and port towns in Normandy, like Dieppe and Rouen to the north. So the makeup here of this migration to Canada, it was somewhat similar to what one saw in Acadia, but not as homogeneous, a bit more of a mixture from different parts of France. Aside from the settler families, many migrants were also indentured servants who were recruited in for terms of service to a seigneur. And these would have to do back-breaking labor, mainly clearing land along the river. And while they were doing this labor, they had their food and tools deducted from their pay. And so they really had to struggle to work off their debts and to try to finish their indentures in the black. So most of these ultimately ended up making not enough money to acquire tenancies or land in Canada, and they either returned to France or journeyed out to the indigenous lands and took up fur trading. This was a much faster and surer way to make a fortune. But at least some fraction of these male indentured servants did also stay in the colony, take up a trade or a farmstead. So all in all, Talon's migration and family policies successfully established a self-reproducing population after about a decade or so. And the settlers tended to clear strips of shoreline called côte along the riverbanks, mainly in the stretch between Quebec and Montreal. And they created rows of farms along these côtes, each one in the form of a long strip with a little bit of river frontage, a farmstead, and then fields behind, and usually a road running behind the farmsteads, connecting them. So there were about 30 of these so-called côtes by the end of the 1600s, and collectively they produced enough food surpluses to supply Quebec and Montreal, and settlers also could then obtain imported goods and become part of the broad transatlantic trading system. Also, the fur trade continued to expand. So in the 1660s to 70s, Montreal in particular became the head of a new trading system. So Montrealiste merchants would employ and dispatch coureurs de bois to the west into the Pays d'Anneau. And as beavers in nearby areas got depleted, they would then journey out farther and farther west, soon as far as Lake Superior. And this travel so far away from Montreal then required semi-permanent outposts to reconnoiter and to take shelter when needed, sometimes even to overwinter. And then the Jesuits would often piggyback on this initial colonization by establishing Catholic missions at the same sites alongside these trading outposts. So Montreal grew as the center of this growing trade. The townspeople built warehouses along the waterfront and also houses, some of them quite impressive, along a second street back from the river shore. In addition, Lachine, which started as a small trading post for the portage around the rapids just to the west, this grew into a village of several hundred people alongside Montreal. So as for the overall growth of the colony, as early as 1668, the population had almost doubled from about 3,200 to 6,200. And this tabulation did not even include the many Christian Indians that lived around mission sites, especially around the Great Lakes. So this was a whole other population of French-aligned Indian Christians that grew and became politically significant. Most importantly, in the 1660s, the Jesuits established a mission on the southern shore of the St. Lawrence, just across from Montreal, in the area of the Rapids, and they called this mission district Sault Saint Louis, or the Cataract of Saint Louis. And some missionaries were able to venture further southward into the Mohawk territory around the juncture of the Hudson and Mohawk rivers in what is modern-day New York State. And there they gained followers fairly quickly, which can seem surprising, right? Because the Haudenosaunee were these traditional enemies of the French. But remember that a large portion of the Wendat, during the truce in the 1650s, a large portion of the Wendat survivors had decided to relocate into the Mohawk country. So by this time, the Mohawk tribe included many Wendats and their children, and many of these were already very familiar with the French and with Catholicism. So now the Christian group among the Mohawk grew quickly, leading to a sort of split in the tribe. Much of it happened among the Wendat decades earlier, between more pro-French and anti-French, Christian and non-Christian. In 1667, a large party of Christian Mohawks who were, seen with great suspicion and hostility by some of their own countrymen, a large party of Christian Mohawks decided to emigrate, and they trekked northward and joined this small Christian Indian town at Sault Ste. Louis. And they massively enlarged this town and renamed it Caughnawaga, after the village on the Mohawk River that many of them came from. So it was sort of New Caughnawaga. And this grew into a large multi-ethnic village with Indians and European colonists of various nations. In 1677, the town was joined by a young recent Christian convert, specifically a young woman named Catherine de Gaquita. So this is a compound name, with Catherine being her Christian baptismal name from Catherine, and de Gaquita being her Mohawk name, meaning one who bumps into things. Now, de Gaquita was especially devout and fervent in her faith. She spent long stretches of time in contemplation and prayer, especially for the well-being of fellow natives. She practiced privations and mortifications of the flesh, such as lying on a bed of thorns when praying. And she did all of this despite ill health, and usually against the advice of the Jesuit priests, who were her confessors. But nonetheless, she was determined. She had the zeal of the convert, and her ascetic practices tended to come straight out of indigenous traditions, right? So there were traditions of self-mortification that included the drawing of blood, but de Gaquita adapted these to Christian uses. And she eventually died in 1680, aged 24. And she was revered locally as an exemplary holy woman, and came to be venerated after her death. And about 300 years later, she was beatified by the Catholic Church and then was canonized in 2012 as a saint. And so she became the first indigenous woman from North America to be recognized as a saint. But this whole sort of spiritual career of Catherine de Gaquita, the growth of Caughnawaga as a Christian Mohawk town, all of this would happen in the aftermath of this mass migration into Canada in the 1660s and 70s under Talon. So Talon, for his part, he retired from office and returned to France in 1672. And this was the end of state-subsidized large-scale migration. So the population growth of Canada began to slow, but it did not stop. It was still considerable, largely because the colonial population had begun to grow on its own from natural increase, not just migration. By 1680, the colony had grown to a population of about 9,800. That's roughly triple what it had been just 15 years earlier. And by 1686, it had almost quadrupled to over 12,000 people. Now, what were these people up to and how did they live? Well, Canada was a society with complex status distinctions based on family, birth, and occupation, roughly patterned on the social structure of the mother country, although it was not as rigid. A small number of titled nobles did migrate to Canada, but relatively few. It was not as significant a class in the colony as it was back in France. And many of these worked in the colonial regime, and then after a number of years, they would often return to France. The more lasting and permanent elite of the colony was composed of high-ranking churchmen and especially landowners. And the most central class axis of Canadian society was the distinction between seigneurs and censitaires. So this was based roughly upon the distinction between lords and commoners and lords and tenants in France. And specifically, the laws that were supposed to be instituted in Canada were patterned on the so-called custom of Paris, the system of rules and laws used in northern France around Paris. And this included a set of reciprocal obligations. So seigneurs were expected to provide protection and communal facilities like mills and village ovens, and they could also set up courts to mediate disputes and mete out justice in their domains. While the tenants or censitaires owed various duties, including rents in the form of a share of crops, occasional labor services, fees for the use of wild lands, including for fishing and hunting, and some other minor duties. But in practice in the colony, these rules were really not enforced and were rarely followed by either side. So the obligations here were not nearly as rigid nor as unequal due to material conditions. So there was a huge demand, just like in Virginia, there was a huge demand for labor in Canada and a great abundance of unimproved land. So hence seigneurs, although they had the power and prestige of these large tracts of land, they really couldn't do much with them without settlers. They were in tremendous need of people to clear and cultivate this land. So the seigneurs had to offer very low rents and fees in order to attract settlers. And then afterward, even once their land was populated, they found it nearly impossible to raise the rents. The habitants were very litigious, and they could go to court to prevent rack renting. And also in terms of status and social deference, the seigneurs had to allow the censitaires wide freedom and reasonable terms, lest they pack up and leave and resettle somewhere else, or just go off and join the fur traders. So their demands in terms of rents and labor were quite light. And while the seigneurs did hold a certain degree of prestige and expected some social deference, like being able to get the nice front pews in church, they also had to show a lot of respect for their tenants, who, for their part, didn't much like to be called censitaires, which foregrounded their duty to pay rents, and instead they insisted on being called habitants, right? A respectable term for settlers, farmers, and hence this term habitant, or hab for short, has become a kind of mark of pride among French Canadians. And you might think of, for example, the hockey team in Montreal. They're called the Canadiens, the Canadians, but their nickname is the Habitants, or Habs for short. So for the most successful colonists, whether these were seigneurs or wealthy traders or professionals in the towns, the aspiration was towards status, the attainment of prestigious occupations, ownership of land, and titles connected to the state or the army, and also lifestyle. And that would include the maintenance of an elegant home fit for social hosting and genteel pastimes like hunting. In this regard, the French-Canadian colonists were very different from their counterparts in other Protestant colonies, especially New England, which can be seen as the opposite extreme. So it was understood in Canada that the purpose of wealth was to be spent and to cultivate social prestige. Whereas if you look at merchants and lawyers in places like Virginia or especially New England, wealth would be accumulated. It was seen as more praiseworthy to be modest in one's lifestyle and to save and reinvest wealth to show thriftiness. Well, in Canada, that would just be seen as hoarding. Right? What is all that money doing? Piling up. And often it seems colonists in Canada would engage in obligations, like when signing a marriage contract or a tenancy agreement. They would commit to certain material obligations even when they really didn't have the resources to fulfill them. The point was, this is what your social station requires you to do. So people spent, gifted, or lent money in accord with their social station, even if their actual resources were low. And then as for the intellectual life of this colony, by the 1670s, it was really fairly extensive, if not especially vibrant or creative. It was mainly cultivated and delimited by the church, by far the great powerful institution in the colony. So Canada had a very literate population. Women in particular were more likely to be literate in Canada than their counterparts were in France. And this is in large part a spillover effect of the strong missionary dimension of the colony. So the colonists could have very good schooling. At Quebec, there was the Jesuit school for boys and the Ursulines convent school for girls. These were both founded quite early in the 1630s, and both educated indigenous children as well as French. Other small schools were then set up in later decades in various other sites in the colony, including Trois-Rivières and Montreal. In 1663, the Vicar Apostolic Laval expanded the so-called Séminaire school at Quebec so that it was now actually equipped to train priests. So the colony could produce their own educated clergy without even having to send their sons or daughters back to Europe. And the only equivalent body that could perform this function in the English colonies at this time was Harvard. Some clergy in Canada were noted and widely read authors. The Jesuit Relations were very popular reading material, and Marie de l'Incarnation in particular was widely respected as an elegant and compelling writer. But ironically, none of these Jesuit Relations were printed within the colony. Rather, the manuscripts had to be sent back to France to be published there. And if any Canadian colonist wanted to read them, they had to somehow obtain copies from across the sea. The colony had no printing press of its own, books had to be imported from France, and they were brought mainly by clergy, and they could be censored if considered heretical or subversive. And all in all, the colony really had no independent republic of letters that did not revolve around France and the church. Now, after 1680, the population growth slowed further, and Quebec and Trois-Rivières more or less plateaued. There was only modest growth in Montreal, and mass migration really stopped. All in all, by 1689, the population of all of New France was about 14,000, and the large majority of them, over 12,000, were in Canada, most of those, of course, in that core area along the river banks between Quebec and Montreal. So it was a substantial colony, about 10 times the size of Acadia to the east, but still less than 1/3 the size of Virginia at the same time, and it still had to rely heavily on indigenous alliances and trade for its existence. So trade, diplomacy, and warfare were still vitally important. Although the towns along the St. Lawrence could at least feed themselves from the farming hinterlands, nonetheless, they were deeply dependent on trade, diplomacy, and the ability to make war. And this period of peace from the 1660s through the 1680s, this would soon end. And conflict over trade and territory would reignite and would then come to dominate the life of the colony for the next 75 years. And of course, the official who had to deal with this new crisis was the governor. So if we look at the governors of New France, for most of this time they were just a series of military officers, most of them pretty obscure. They exercised some power, mainly in diplomacy, but none really set the agenda of the colony. They were largely overshadowed by the intendants, because there was, as we said, this period of peace from 1667 through the mid-1680s. And the colony mainly revolved around civil administration, settlement, growth, and evangelization. So in the 1660s and early 1670s, the governors were overshadowed by Talon and Laval. The first really important and impactful governor was Louis Boade, Comte de Frontenac, who was in office from 1672 to 82, and again from 1689 to 98. So Frontenac came into office in 1672, the same year that Talon left. And for his part, he was determined to consolidate and safeguard the gains that had been made during Talon's time. So he sought to secure the colony as a base from which France could fend off all competitors for dominance in North America, and most of all the English. So there was a rising English threat that could already be seen on the horizon, even before Talon left office. The English had always been a sort of menace on the horizon, but this tension reached a new intensity in the 1660s, when a series of events unfolded that amplified the competition from the English into an existential threat to New France. And these dangers came from two directions at once, both the north and the south. So to look at the south first, which early on appeared to be the more important one. In August 1664, an English fleet sponsored by James the Duke of York, the brother of the English king, captured New Amsterdam from the Dutch, and they renamed it New York. A few weeks later, in September 1664, they also accepted the surrender of the Dutch Fort Orange in the Hudson Valley. So the English gained control of the whole colony that had been New Netherlands, and also of the fur trade in and around the Hudson Valley. So the English, as compared to the Netherlands, they had a much bigger and more powerful state and navy. And this created great anxiety on the part of the French about new competition, encroachment, and possibly renewed aggression from the English to the south. And this led to the beginning of a kind of inter-imperial Cold War and rising militarization and fortification. So, for instance, in 1665, the French built another fort called Sainte-Thérèse on the Richelieu River to try to protect their southern flank. But this fort was abandoned just 2 years later. In the mid-1670s, there was further escalation along this southern frontier as the English made an informal alliance with the Haudenosaunee through a series of accords called the Covenant Chain. And then the tension was further compounded by unexpected English pressure coming from the opposite direction in the north. So this new menace to the north was the result of some earlier events when the Crown had taken over control of Canada in the 1660s. So in 1663, shortly after the royal takeover of the colony, the French regime had tried to rein in unlicensed fur trading in these distant lands to the far north and west of the colony. And in particular, they condemned two fur trading partners named Radisson and Groseilliers because they had been illegally trading in the lands north of Lake Superior. And the government seized 4/5 of their stores of pelts as a fine for this unlicensed trading. Now, Radisson and Groseilliers were outraged, and they quickly jumped ship to the English. They offered the English their services in exploring and establishing trade links in distant lands to the north and west of Canada. And in 1669, their English backers funded an expedition where Groseilliers and Radisson explored Hudson Bay and James Bay, those sort of semi-Arctic bays up to the north, connected to the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. In 1670, the English crown chartered the so-called Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay, later simply called Hudson's Bay Company. And these English traders around Hudson's Bay had to contend with deep, cold, barren tundras and ice blocking even sea passages in winter. But it also had a great advantage, offering direct access without middlemen to the best, thickest beaver furs, which grew in the extreme cold. So the English presence and influence in the far north grew through the 1670s, and it created a danger of encirclement by England. No longer was this just a menace on Canada's southern flank. Now they had to be aware of the English on both sides, and the threat of a pincer attack from both directions. So the great overriding priority of the 1670s and 80s was holding off this looming English threat. And there were different ways of doing this. For one, geographically, by breaking out of encirclement and outflanking the English. This would require rapid expansion and extension of power to the south and the west. So Colbert in France supported further investment to extend fur trading further to the west and to try to preempt the English and isolate the Hudson's Bay traders in the north. In 1669, a trading outpost was founded at Lachine on the island just upriver to the west of Montreal, and this later grew into a large settlement. In 1671, the intendant Talon sent military officers to the Jesuit mission that had been founded a few years before at Sault Ste. Marie. So that's an outpost on the channel connecting Lake Superior and Lake Huron, hence having great strategic importance. And the military commandant who was dispatched to Sault Ste. Marie laid claim formally to the homelands of the Ottawas, which includes much of present-day Ontario and Michigan. In 1672, a Jesuit missionary named Albanel set out on a journey northward from Tadoussac, voyaging up the Saguenay River and then overland, and he finally reached James Bay. And this verified the English operation to the north and proved to the French that they could also reach those shores by land. Also, later in 1672, the new governor, Comte de Frontenac, took up office, and more than anyone before, he saw agricultural settlement in the St. Lawrence Valley as no more than a base to support these strategic interests in the continent. And he defied the preferences of Colbert and the royal government in France by sponsoring rapid exploration and expansion to the point of threatening war. In 1673, the governor Frontenac sent two adventurers named Joliet and Marquette to travel west to find the upper reaches of the Mississippi and trace where it would lead. And the French knew by this time that it existed from the Spanish, but they didn't know where it actually ran, and they hoped that it could serve as another artery for trade and exploration in the vast interior of the continent. So they crossed from Lake Michigan through modern-day Wisconsin and reached the upper Mississippi River, and then traveled hundreds of miles down as far as the modern-day state of Mississippi, and then returned. So they were now gaining extensive knowledge and contacts far into the continent that could possibly cut off English expansion. Also, Frontenac launched a multi-pronged campaign to seize and fortify all the important choke points controlling traffic within the Great Lakes system and beyond. In 1673, the governor ordered the building of a wood palisaded fortress called Fort Frontenac at the eastern end of Lake Ontario, where the lake begins to drain through the Thousand Islands into the St. Lawrence River. And 2 years later, he had the fort rebuilt in stone, now a serious stronghold. In building this fortress, Frontenac defied the merchants of Montreal, who didn't want the fur trade channels to be diverted to the south, and more importantly, the Haudenosaunee, who considered the land on the lake to be within their territory, and finally, even the royal minister Colbert, who didn't want to provoke a war with the Confederacy, nor with their increasingly powerful ally, the English. Nonetheless, in this mid-1670s, the Montreal merchants, for their part, they raised capital on their own to fund construction of another fortified outpost at Michilimackinac on the straits linking Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. In the later 1670s, Frontenac had another fort built called Fort Niagara on the Niagara River, which links Lake Ontario with Lake Erie. So they were now really starting to encircle the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And soon after, they established a chain of small outposts on the Illinois River, reaching down from close to Lake Michigan to the Mississippi. In 1678, Frontenac commissioned a merchant named René Robert de La Salle to explore southward into the continent. And in 1679, La Salle launched the first sailing ship on the Great Lakes above Niagara Falls, called Le Griffon. And this sailed all the way from Lake Erie up to Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, but it soon sank in a storm. Still, La Salle pressed on, and he set up more small outposts in present-day Michigan before returning to Fort Frontenac. In 1680, the Haudenosaunee saw this growing threat and competition from the French and their trading partners, and they began to attack westward to try to disrupt these new forming nodes and networks. So the conflict only continued to escalate. 1682 was a pivotal year. In this year, the French expanded dramatically to the north and south at once. So as for the south, La Salle took an exploratory party and set out to the Mississippi. He successfully sailed all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and he claimed this entire river valley, christening it Louisiana. In the north, the French chartered the so-called Compagnie de la Baie du Nord to compete directly with the Hudson's Bay Company. Starting in 1686, the governor began to send troops and militias on a long, withering campaign of raids and attacks upon the English merchants and outposts in the north, and they soon captured 3 English outposts and 50,000 pelts. Around the same time, new conflicts were brewing in the west. So French traders began exploring and setting up seasonal outposts on the north and west shores of Lake Superior, as far as the Lake in the Woods, at the present-day juncture of Minnesota, Ontario, and Manitoba. This combined with existing outposts along the Illinois and the upper Mississippi, and together they truly threatened to hem in the Haudenosaunee and totally commandeer the fur trade from the interior. In 1683, the French set up a permanent garrison of troupes de la marine, or Royal Marines, at Montreal, prepared for war in the west. And a few years later, the town was fortified with new palisades. So in 1684, the Haudenosaunee, seeing this aggressive French expansion and militarization, they made a formal military alliance with the English and prepared for a joint campaign against the French. But the French, anticipating this, took the initiative and attacked the Haudenosaunee first. They began to raid the Haudenosaunee frontiers first in 1684 and then again in 1687, when the new governor de Nonville sent a large force of over 1,700 soldiers and militiamen southward to attack the Haudenosaunee. They raided a Cayuga town, and they attacked and destroyed a Seneca town on the south shore of Lake Ontario, near what is present-day Rochester. Now, all of this was despite a treaty being in place between France and England that was supposed to ensure peace between their respective colonies. But the French, under de Nonville, they had some plausible deniability, since they were technically attacking the Haudenosaunee and not the English themselves. But still, they knew who was allied with whom. And in 1688, the French governor forced the Haudenosaunee to sign a truce and make favorable concessions to the French. But then shortly after, later in 1688, England back in Europe joined into the 9 Years' War against France. And the English then reopened the conflict in North America, starting in the east. So fights and skirmishes began to break out between the English and French in Acadia, as the governor of the Dominion of New England sent teams to attack French outposts in southern Acadia on the coast of present-day Maine. So this fighting now between New England and French Acadia would start to spill over into Canada in 1689, when the English urged the Mohawks to rejoin their wars against the French. So the two allies, England and the Mohawks, launched a joint attack on the settlement of Lachine, just west of Montreal, killing several dozen people and torching the settlement. After this attack, the warfare would soon escalate and be subsumed into a massive inter-imperial war, which again threatened the survival of New France. But we will get into that at a later time, after we've discussed the New England colonies and this series of crises in the 1680s that led to this renewed war. But suffice it to say that inter-imperial war with the English and later the British Empire would become one of the defining conditions of New France for as long as it would last. So thank you so much for listening, and in conclusion, I would again like to ask what people think about this idea of a live discussion with patrons, and I would like to thank the Great Plains Midwest, and more specifically, my current active patrons in the Midwestern states of the United States west of the Mississippi, including in Minnesota, Luke Larson, Chip Mowry, and Mallory Boyink, in Missouri, Bobby and Rachel Brown in Kansas City and Rachel in St. Louis, and in Nebraska, John Shea S.J. and Spencer. Thank you.